Hi, everybody. I hope you've been having a great chat and you're raring to go. Right, so hopefully you're all seeing my screen at this point. Yeah? Okay. And for this session, because it's about writing, then I'm going to ask you to have some kind of writing tools to hand. Now that might just be, as Lizzie is saying, you might have the old-fashioned pen and paper, or you might want to be writing on a document on your screen. So in which case you might want to exit full screen if you're on full screen in Zoom. We're going to be using the chat as well. So if you want to make sure that your chat is open as well, we can line everything up, and we're going to be doing quite a lot of writing in this little micro writing talk. Okay, so micro writing, small things make a big difference. So I think, as this is kind of quite a short session, and I think it's always good to look at how one small twist can make a big difference in our teaching. So this is nothing revolutionary, it's not radical, it's nothing new, but hopefully it's a new way of looking at something that we already do. Okay, so what is micro writing? So this is your very first task. A very short definition in the chat. No more than 10 words, please. Can you define micro writing? How would you define micro writing? Okay, nice. I think I don't know is a great definition. Okay, wonderful. So lots and lots of different takes on what micro writing might be. So let's have a look at a couple of them. So micro writing obviously is something which is short, and it can be all kinds of different things. Basically, for our purposes, it is a whole text, not part of a text. And in all of the activities that we're going to be looking at very briefly now, that is one of the things that the task is a short text which is completed within the activity. So it's not the beginning of a text or the end of the text, or which all are also really, really useful, valid, generative activities as well. But in this case, they're all short texts. So looking into the real world, where do we see short texts, and what kind of short texts do we see day to day? Can you, again, in the chat box, you're doing all the work for me. Okay, so we're getting ads, informal emails, tweets, texts on WhatsApp Messenger, SMS, DMs, Facebook posts, recipes, signs, etc. Okay, so we're flooded by micro texts all around us all the time. And the more we live online as well, the more we're bombarded by micro texts. And they might be on their own, or they might be part of some kind of a multimodal object, in the sense of it could be a caption to an Instagram photo, or it could be the comments below the line. This would be one kind of micro text. Okay, so I'm very quickly going to tell you how I divide them into kind of 3 different types, genres, should we say, of microtext. So, and you have a writing task. I'm going to ask you to, first of all, with your pen down or your fingers off the keyboards or whatever is your writing means, to just listen to my 3 definitions. And then when I've finished, as soon as I've finished, I'd like you to summarize them in 3 bullet points but I'm not going to ask you to share those with me. So this isn't writing in the chat box. This is writing for you. Okay, so and I'm just going to very quickly go over what I think of as the main genres. Okay, so pens down, fingers off keyboards. This is the listening task first, and then you do the summary. Okay, so my first one is kind of literature. And we have all kinds of short texts which are in literature. Obviously, the Japanese haiku is an example, but also mini sagas, the 50-word short story, for example, flash fiction. Again, this is kind of maybe breaks with the trend of it, with what I was saying about it being a text which is complete, because it can also be a longer story which is told in short installments. So within the genre of literature, we see lots of microtexts. The other one is the one that was in your brainstorm in the chat box a lot, and I think that's obvious because look where we are right now. So this would be kind of the 21st century short text, which is basically social media mediated. So all the way that we kind of condense messages into a few words that say a lot, in the same way as also video is being used now as well. So that could be considered also like a micro text, although now we're looking at written. So it would be status updates or messages, stuff like that. And finally, there's the academic, the microwriting in the classroom. And this is tied a lot in my mind to a movement called Writing to Learn, which we're going to look at in a little bit more detail in a minute. So now that was my speedy rush through the three genres, and I'm now going to take a breath and allow you to summarize that in 3 bullet points, but for yourselves, not to share, just a quiet moment to make 3 bullet points. The silence of busy writing. Okay, I don't know if I've given you enough time to write your bullet points yet. Obviously, if I were doing this with a class, then we would have hands up or reactions or something on your photos, on your profile photos, or on your camera, so that I could see that you'd finished. But however, basically, I would expect you now to have 3 bullet points. One would be literature, one would be 21st century, and one would be academic or in the classroom. Okay, so now let's just take a minute to look at the movement that I talked about, the Writing to Learn movement. Is anyone familiar with the Writing to Learn movement? Could you tell me in the chat box if you're familiar with it, if you think you know what it is and where it's coming from? Okay, getting nopes, nevers. Okay, so not surprising. It's not something which is part of the ELT world as such, although I think we intuitively and naturally take a lot of concepts, activities, ideas from this movement. It's actually a movement from the 1970s. It started in the US. It's based on in content teaching in STEM, surprisingly. So writing for science, writing for learning as a scientist. And the idea was very simple, was that basically to slow down the kind of transmission lessons of science class for undergrads in university, it was considered that what they should do, they should stop and just write what they had understood. Very simple, that's all it was. But it was an experiment in getting people to process the information they were getting, paraphrase it, say it in their own words. It was, the writing was not checked, The writing was a kind of a part of the learning process, and basically it was helping students to reflect on and process the information they were receiving at various steps throughout the lesson. So they did a lot of research on it, and it was considered something that really aided retention. But it was this idea that slowing down a moment, focusing your attention on expressing something which maybe is complex, but in your own words. And this was the writing to learn. So that I think then when we move this into ELT, the importance is to make a difference between learning to write and writing to learn. So most of the activities we're going to look at together now come under the writing to learn header rather than the learning to write. So in an ELT classroom, teaching our students to write a particular kind of text is totally valid, but that's not the focus that we've got at the moment. Okay. So the idea is that if we move this into language learning, that anytime when we actually ask the students to stop and express their thoughts in words, the actual production of the language, of making meaning, is a learning process. That's when they're making decisions about which language resources they're calling on, how they're going to use them. It's a really complex cognitive activity, but the product might be very, very simple. So we're going to look a little bit at products as well as process. Okay, moving on then. This is another quick writing task for you. I'd like you to think about how you use writing in your classroom, whether that's an online classroom, a hybrid classroom, a face-to-face classroom, any kind of classroom. And can you complete these sentences? Again, this is for you, not for sharing in the chat box at the moment. This is an example of delayed writing, in the sense that we can ask our students to produce some kind of short text at the beginning of the lesson, and we'll come back to it at the end of the lesson and maybe work with it a little bit more. So this is something I'm going to ask you to write now and then set aside, as it were. So again, we're going to have 15, 20 seconds of writing time. Okay, I don't know if I've given you enough time or not, but maybe when you come back to these at the end, you might have something you want to add, you might have something that'll have changed, or it might be exactly the same. Okay, so moving on then. We have very quickly flown through a list of different task types here. We've done lots of different micro writing tasks together. So again, we're going back to the chat box. What can you remember? What kind of tasks have we done so far? What writing tasks have I set you? What have I asked you to do? So we've got to summarize, we've got lists, complete the sentence. Yeah, sentence completion, that's a favorite there in the chat box. Okay, so this was my little list here. Definitions. So we kicked off with the definition of microwriting, the bullet points where you summarized my rapid machine gun fire summaries of the 3 genres. Then I skipped the writing a summary of writing to learn. That would have been another way of doing a summary. One of my favorite ways of using summaries in class is to use them dotted here and there. And you can ask students to summarize anything. So for example, after a listening text and you've done all of the work that you wanted to do, the listening, develop the listening, and then you ask them simply to write a summary of the listening text of whatever the topic was, or if it was a conversation or whatever. And first of all, you allow them just the freedom to write whatever kind of summary they want. And then I turn it into what I call a competitive summary by asking them to reduce it to a certain number of words. So you might say, okay, so you've written your summary. Could you now cut it down to 20 words or fewer than 20 words? And so I think this works really well as a collaborative task, because the students will have some kind of base text that they're working with, and together they condense the text they've got already. And this is an incredibly good intensive writing task. Any kind of summary where you're asked to cut down and say something in fewer words is a really great cognitive challenge, and it really makes the students think about which words they need, which they don't, synonyms, paraphrasing. So, but it takes very little time. It takes absolutely no prep, which is always a good thing. And you can just pull one out of your hat whenever you want. So as I say, after a listening, after a reading, after a speaking task, at any point. And it kind of adheres a little bit to the writing to learn, the basic initial concept of writing to learn. This idea that we're just asking the students to use the language to hone a message. We're not asking them to think of what the message is. They don't have to come up with their own ideas. They're just honing a message that's already there. Okay, and sentence completion. This was the one that was the favorite in the chat box. So, my kind of initial interest in these kind of tasks and noticing how effective they were came about in the days of paper and very few digital tools in the classroom. The classroom I was working in at the time, although it isn't that long ago, it feels long ago now because of the whole last year and how it's turned our teaching world upside down. But I was working in a classroom with a huge blackboard, 20 high school students, very mixed levels, because this was a mainstream class. They were in their last year at school preparing for the university entry exam, but I had students in that class who were A2 level, struggling, and ones who'd already passed CAE, so they were a good strong C1, and I needed to be able to cater to all of them at the same time. So the thing that I found that helped me most of all was to have an envelope full of strips of paper, which I could just hand out and we could use for all kinds of micro writing tasks. So that's where they started. So I've been reusing them for quite a few years, and they also lend themselves beautifully to digital tools, to an online classroom. And we'll kind of, as I go through them, we'll think about that, about like, okay, so this is how it works on paper, but how can we use it digitally as well? And I thought this was great. You can find anything on Flickr. It was like this photo I could find for 3 strips of paper. Okay. Have a look at this photo. What do you think's going on? In the chat box, could you just write a word, a one-word caption for this photo? Or if one word is difficult, you can use 2 or 3. Drama, I like it. Parade, memorial, character, Mardi Gras. Deconstructed elf, wonderful. Okay, so Mardi Gras is the one that came closest. This is the after effects of Carnival, as it were, when one of the Carnival statues was being taken apart. It's not Las Fallas in Valencia, it's Carnival in Cadiz, which is my hometown. So I was working obviously with students in Cadiz, and Carnival is a big thing, and everybody has something to say about it. Most people love it, some people also hate it. So this was the topic of our lesson. And the first thing that we did in the lesson was a very simple brainstorming. So I'm sorry, this is an awful photo with the flash on my phone against this blackboard. You can only see part of the blackboard, which stretched the whole of the room. But basically the idea was to just brainstorm any words associated with carnival. And so we've got here streamers, cotton candy, tourists, makeup, sandwich. And I'm going like, sandwich? Why sandwich? Because we always take sandwiches from home when we go out on carnival, because it's impossible to buy anything to eat anywhere because of the queues. And so there was an explanation for each word. It worked for my group of mixed levels because people were writing stuff at their own level. So if I had the weaker students, if they could just put something simple up, for example, the sandwich, and someone else would put something simpler, but I knew they could do more, then I could just tap them on the shoulder, rub their word off the board and ask them to put something else. And so we would build up this kind of mass of vocabulary, which then the students would explain to each other. So each student would be responsible for explaining their own word to the class if the other students didn't understand it. So we had the peer teaching of the higher level students to the lower level students supporting each other, but also explaining why they'd chosen the word. So it wasn't only what could have been seen as a patronizing, I know this word, you don't, but it's kind of, well, I chose this word because of this reason. And basically we're just creating a whole massive language that the lower level students can use for scaffolding then for the next tasks. So the next task, going on from, oh, sorry, we'll come back to that. Going on from the brainstorming was the strips of paper and definitions. So it's a very simple definition, carnival is. And the way I used it with my strips of paper and with this class and the whole idea of split levels, but it also works with different timings, you know, so like some people write quickly, some people write slowly. So I would have a whole mass of strips of paper, hand them out to everyone. And as I saw that definitions were being written, I'd collect them in and give another piece of paper. So I'd ask the fast finishers to actually write a second or even a third definition. As I collected them in, I would read them out so that and people had to either give a thumbs up or a thumbs down on the definition if they agreed or not, but they were also acting as model examples for the students who were stuck, who didn't know what they wanted to write. And so there was this dual thing of the contributions were being shared with everyone, but also they were being used for scaffolding. And so the whole class is kind of busy the whole time. Now, how would we be able to transfer this kind of activity online? Well, do you recognize these two icons? Just very quickly in the chat box, can anybody? Okay, we've got Padlet on the left and Nicole Jamboard on the right. That's right. So these are great tools, digital tools for brainstorming. So you could just share the Padlet link with the students, and then you share your screen with the Padlet and you see all of the words just popping up on there. Or Jamboard is even quicker. The beauty of Padlet is that it's a link, no sign up, nothing required. With Jamboard, it's on Google, so you may have problems if people don't have a Google account. But Jamboard is wonderful because it's like an interactive whiteboard, and one of the things you can do on Jamboard is write sticky notes. So you can just cover your Jamboard with sticky notes, and in just the same way as we have the strips of paper here with the definitions, then we would have them up on the Padlet screen, for example. So these are some of the types. So you can see that there's a range of language here in my classroom. Carnival is a time of funny, for example. That was kind of, you know, this is one of the one end of the client, as it were. And the other, carnival for me is one of the worst kinds of tourism possible for Cadiz. It only leads to lots of drunk people who don't really spend any money here and end up peeing on the street. However, it's fun. So this was kind of showing the two ends of the climb that I had in the classroom, but each one of these definitions, reading them out, the students would agree or disagree, and they were all given equal value. So this is kind of building up to a longer text. And you can see that I've annotated a couple of corrections there, and the definition would actually go back to the person who wrote it with a little correction on it, or it would be a correction that I wrote looking over their shoulder as they were writing. So this is a very, very simple definition task. The next task is one which is actually more of a reading task than a writing task. However, what we did was I found this task, this text written by someone called Jason Renshaw in Australia, where he had been writing about a local festival. And what I asked the students to do was to look at this and underline every part of the text, which was also true for Carnival in Cadiz. So, and to cross out words that weren't. Let's just look at the first sentence. So with the first sentence, they would do this. Carnival is a special festival held in Cadiz each year towards the end of February. Very little needed to change there. It first began in, okay, so now this is where they have to start thinking about the local festival, changing the text, making it more about Cadiz. So it started in the 18th century and has grown to become Spain's largest carnival festival, and so on. So they basically rewrote the text simply by editing it and made it their own about Cadiz. This is an exercise which works beautifully digitally and also fantastically on Wikipedia texts, where students can go in to a text which is like really local and edit it and correct it and make changes that they think need to be made to that text. So we did that once with a text on the cathedral in the main square in Cadiz. And the students were quite put out that some of the information was completely wrong and they wanted to rewrite it. So this is kind of stretching microwriting a little maybe, but the idea is that it didn't take long. There was still the same intensity of choosing words. It was editing rather than writing. And it really, again, buys into that whole idea of writing for learning, where the ideas are very much there already. You're not looking for ideas. You're just thinking about the best way to put them across. Or in this case, and it worked really nicely with teenagers, the laziest way to put it across. So it was the fewest words possible that you could edit and have a text which you'd completely transformed to say what you wanted to say. So that's our first activity, was Carnival. Okay, so we're going to move on to another activity now. But before we do, let's just take a pause. Do you have any questions or comments on the Carnival activity? No? Okay, so this one is, I'm just going to call it pastimes. And it's quite obvious what this girl's pastime is. So one of the things I was doing with these students was we were also doing some learning to write, not just writing to learn, but learning to write, because one of the things, Holly, I'll come back to that question in a sec. One of the things that the students have to do in the university entrance exam is write a short essay, and it is 3 marks out of the total 10, which they need then. I don't know if you know the Spanish system at all, but it all works out as an aggregate grade that they get in the end. So every single exam kind of mashes into this average. So the more points they can get on their English exam, the better. Okay, so the Carnival exercise, you were asking me about levels. As I say, I was working with my group, which was an A2 through to a C1. I think that the text that we chose was kind of somewhere in the middle of it's kind of a B1 level text. So if I was using it with a stronger level, then I would want to work a lot on them enriching the language, making it more complex. With a lower level, then just very simple editing was fine. So I think it's the kind of activity can work up or down, basically, because we're working a lot with what the students are giving us. And I think that was the level, and alone or collaboratively, it was like the brainstorming was alone, definitions was alone, but then when they did the editing, it was collaborative, and using groupings where there were stronger and weaker students. So the stronger students were coaching the weaker students through the activity. But I had this kind of rule with them that the stronger students were kind of my classroom assistants, and they were allowed to help, but they weren't allowed to do. And so we talked about, like, what do I do? Do I tell you the answer, or do I ask you? Do I prompt you? How do we go about it? Do I just do the work for you? And so they, on the whole, seemed to be really happy to imitate teacher mode, and worked really well within these collaborative groups. Okay, so Pastimes was the title of a lesson very similar, brainstormed pastimes, which were boring, which were interesting, talked about them a little bit, why were they there on the board? And then they had to write, they had to answer this question, which is a typical question which might come up in the exam. Describe one of your favorite pastimes, explain why you enjoy it, and recommend it to other people. We have this student who I dictated the question to them, so she didn't quite get the dictation right, but she's got it. I asked them to identify the verbs and to use the verbs to structure their answer. So verb number 1, describe. Verb number 2, explain. Verb number 3, recommend. So these essays typically have a 3-paragraph structure. So the verbs tell them what they need to do in each paragraph, and this was her first draft, which was written very quickly. This was speed writing, and it was done there and then in the class, and it was a first draft. But they were reticent to write anyway, so this was kind of, this was good. But what I did was I worked with this, and I'll show you how. I took away their writings and I typed them up, basically. Now, if they were already doing them digitally, then that would be wonderful. You wouldn't need to type them up. You'd already have the digital text. I tidied it up a little bit with taking out superficial mistakes like spelling, adding in, correcting the punctuation a little bit, making it look like a tidy text. But I also put there the number of words. And the number of words that they're supposed to write in the exam is 150. So this is very, very short of where they've got to be. So then at the bottom of the writing, I have some questions. What kind of stories do you write? Do you write for yourself? Do you let anybody else read what you've written? And using these questions, then she needed to pad out her writing. Now, this could be done individually, or I've used it as well where I get the students to write the questions for each other or for themselves. So you say, look, you've got 57 words. Read this. What can you add? So either they write the questions to themselves or they write the questions to each other. Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to flick forward that quickly. So any questions about this pastime lesson? Now, again, I think that this can work at a lot of different levels. I would say A2 could work with this, but also you could work with C1 if you're getting them to speed write the first draft and see what they can say, pinpointing the key verbs that they're working with, the key communicative verbs. Okay, so moving on quickly to this little dog here, who very much looks like the kind of dog who might eat your homework. So this was an activity that happened. It wasn't planned. This class that I'd been teaching at high school, I had to miss one class. Someone covered for me. There was homework set, but of course the teacher wasn't me. It was a substitute teacher, Natalie. And they didn't take it seriously because Natalie set the homework, not Ceri. So, obviously it wasn't homework to be done. So when I came into the classroom and it was like, who's done the homework? Who's done the homework? No one's done the homework. So I gave them my strips of paper and I said, I'm sorry, no homework is no good. Unless you can give me a really good excuse. So we got the classic, my dog ate my homework. And so I kind of accepted the first excuses, but I'm going, these are a bit lame. I need a little bit more. I've heard this one before. And so they'd get another strip of paper and another strip of paper until they could produce a good excuse. So we got some of these, and you can see that they've worked on these and they were working on these together. So there was this idea that, you know, sort of, you're not alone here, get together and think up a creative excuse. So I don't know, can you read the handwriting here? We had loads of fun with this idea that there was a black market in Cadiz where the students could sell homework. But it wasn't homework that you did yourself. No, you stole someone else's homework in order to sell it on the black market. So I think that was a group of boys. And then a group of girls came up with kind of riffing on the idea of the dog ate my homework. The imaginary dog was having a fight with the imaginary dragon, and the dragon burnt the homework. So it was like, this is wonderful, fantastic. A creative excuse like this is, you know, it's as good as doing your homework. And so this then kind of became a running joke. And from then on, any missed homework had to be accompanied by some kind of creative excuse. But here you can just see that it was anything can get them writing, and they really got into this. So it was one of those incidental micro-writing activities. Okay, these were a little bit more boring, but they worked hard at it, and you can see that we worked on it together as well. And this first one, I could say, you are the only person who said sorry. So that was like, you know, thank you. This isn't just a joke. And so that was the my dog ate my homework. Okay, so when I first started using these micro-writing tasks, these were the social media icons around the place. You can see that they're all really old-fashioned. Some of them, I mean, Skype hasn't changed, I suppose, and WhatsApp, I don't know about you, but here in Spain, it is absolutely, literally taken over everything. So some of these are still great channels for micro-writing tasks. WhatsApp is fantastic. Google Plus died a death and doesn't exist anymore. Instagram here in Spain is absolutely the social media of choice of teenagers. Facebook, don't even mention it. That's just for oldies. And Twitter as well. Really are the kids now. So if I was teaching those teens now, it would all be Insta and TikTok. And that's where we would get our micro writing inspiration from. So, but the idea was that we can frame short writing tasks as being realistic genres by asking students to write a social media update, a caption. So these are genres that they're already really familiar with. And so they already have the conventions in their L1. And in fact, you might find, depending on the students that you're working with, that they're also borrowing from English quite a lot for that kind of social media chat. So there are little snippets of borrowed English that are coming in as chunks of language rather than just words. Okay, so back to the beginning. And this was your sentence completion exercise early on. So do you want to revisit this? And maybe you could edit it slightly like we did with the carnival text. So I'm going to use writing too. Or a good thing about writing is you might want to add to what you wrote at the beginning of the session. And so what I'm going to ask you, rather than asking you to share your sentence completions, I'm just going to ask you to tell me in the chat Have you changed them at all? So looking back at your sentences from the beginning, is there anything that you would add or edit or change? Okay, I'm getting yeses in the chat box. Lovely. Okay, so have a look at the photos as little kind of aid memoirs to jog our memories about what we've quickly had a look at. And if there's anything that you'd like to ask, please feel free to post your question in the chat.
What are your thoughts about creativity versus grammar accuracy?
So I think the thing is that the message and the meaning comes first, but the meaning needs to be expressed as clearly as possible. And so my feelings about the pushing for accuracy would depend very much on the confidence of that particular student and what point I thought they were at in their ability to hone their expression or not. So it's less level but more confident. So I wouldn't want to inhibit someone by insisting too much on accuracy if the message is coming across, if I know they're doing the best they can. But if I'm seeing someone who's being lazy and sloppy, then it'll be, you can do that better. You can express yourself better. You know, you're better than this piece of writing that you have sloppily thrown down on the paper. So I wouldn't, definitely wouldn't abandon accuracy. I think accuracy and creativity work together. You know, you kind of, an artist is accurate in their art. If that makes sense.
Great, thank you so much. And you can email us, of course, info@teachinghouse.group if you want information about any of our courses or anything like that. And have a wonderful rest of your morning/afternoon/evening. Thanks for coming.